Hi, everyone. We're so glad that you have joined us today. We are going to be talking about the differences that we see between home births and hospital births. And I think this is a topic we're really excited to dive into. But before we do that, Jen, how are you doing? How has your week been?
It's been good. I've had a client who's had a lot of prodromal labor, so we keep thinking we're going to go to a birth and then we don't. So juggling that and kids, it's just busy. How are you?
Kind of similar client that is like right on the brink, a couple of clients that are right on the brink of having their babies. And they're both multips. They both live like far away from me, relatively speaking. And so everybody's kind of on edge and just waiting for that phone call or text to come. I've had a lot of like prodromal stuff going on. So I
Yeah.
think everybody's a little tired, but hopefully we'll have babies in the next week for both of
Yeah.
these. So
How
yeah.
far is kind of far for you when you say
One birth is, well, with no traffic, it's 35 minutes. But like yesterday afternoon, when they texted me, it was an hour and 10 minutes with traffic. So it's kind of far
Yeah,
and
that can be
similar.
far for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. The other one's about like 30 minutes at 2 a.m., but an hour at 5 p.m. So
Yeah.
yeah, we'll see. It's definitely like nerve-wracking. I was really lucky this summer. I had like a handful of births that were within like 2 minutes of my house. Like it was just so close. And it literally
Yeah.
felt like a
You get
dream. I was like,
spoiled.
I just want to like do births in this little radius because it was so,
Right.
I just felt so much more relaxed because I knew I would have plenty of time no matter when it happened. So
Yeah.
yeah, but of course that's the fantasy world. We have to expand a little bit further out than our neighborhood, but I would love
Yeah.
if I was only doing births in the close proximity to
Yeah.
home.
Wouldn't that be amazing? Right?
Yes, it
You
would.
can just walk to all of them. I
Yes.
live really rural, so I would have no clients, but yeah, I feel good when I'm like 30 minutes or less.
Right.
Feel
Right. Feels nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys again for joining us. And we cannot wait to talk about home birth, hospital birth with you all today. Hi, it's Monet and Jen, and we are the co founders of Birth Becomes You. We are birth photographers and doulas with over 10 years of experience. We've attended over 1,000 births collectively. We started Birth Becomes You to create a safe space for new and experienced birth photographers to share and grow. We aim to equip and empower birth workers to feel confident in the birth space and take beautiful, world changing images. We believe in a world where birth is visible, where shame is absent, where fear is translated to power, and where each individual's experience is honored as valid and valued. We are so glad you're here, and we can't wait to learn and connect with you. All right. So I think one of the coolest parts about our job as birth photographers is that we spend a lot of time at both hospital births and home births. I find that most birth workers either land in one camp or the other. Like doulas, for example, doulas by and large, at least here in Denver, are at hospitals. Is that the same in Michigan?
Yes.
Yeah,
Almost all of my doula photography births are happening in hospitals. Not
right,
all, but most,
right.
really.
So we have a lot of doulas that are in the hospital camp and see a lot of hospital birth. Then, of course, we have our community or home birth midwives who are, by and large, mostly staying at home and, occasionally going into the hospital with their clients when they have to transfer, but that's on a rare occasion. And then we have L&D nurses and OBs who are at the hospital pretty much the entire time. They don't see home births unless they themselves have a home birth or maybe a close friend has a home birth. So I think birth photographers are really lucky in that we get to spend a lot of time in both of these spaces. And we thought it
Hmm.
would be good today to talk about some of the differences that we see between home births and hospital births. I will say that I think over the last 10 years, they have started to kind of get a little bit closer together, but they are still very distinct and different experiences.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think that is probably the overarching thesis of this conversation is that it's a very different experience to have a baby at home versus at the hospital.
Yes. And it's different to support, as doulas and birth photographers as well. It's different for us, and our experience is different too.
Absolutely. I mean, even when I think about going to a home birth versus going to a hospital birth, when I'm going to a hospital birth, I have to like find parking in the middle of the night. I'm walking
Mhm.
through, you know, quiet, sometimes dark spaces to get to the hospital. I have to go through a metal detector. I have to present my ID. I have to get a badge. I have to talk to security, all of
Mhm.
that to like get into the birth space. Versus a home birth, I just drive up to my client's house and I walk in the front door, which is usually unlocked, and I'm in their living room. So it's very different, even from the very
Mhm.
beginning of the process,
Yes.
to go to a home birth versus a hospital birth. But I think in that kind of train of thought, I think one of the biggest differences that I see between the two is what it looks like when labor begins, right? Or when active labor begins, and what a different process it is for the person giving birth when it's like, okay, I'm in active labor. What does that mean, right? What does it look like in those two places? For hospital clients, you're often in communication with your provider and you're calling most of the time you're calling like a call line and then you're waiting for a call back.
Mhm.
And I always find that for my hospital clients, as soon as like they talk to somebody, the provider is like, okay, you should come into the hospital. It's
Yeah.
like it doesn't matter how active or not active they are, like the go-to line is you should come in. And
Yep.
so inevitably they get in the car and they drive to the hospital. So that in and of itself, I think is a huge task for anybody in labor, right? That's hard. It's hard
Mhm.
to be having contractions, get into a car and drive for like 10, 30, 60 minutes to get to a hospital.
And you might not stay at the hospital
Right.
either.
Right.
I mean, I've had multiple clients even this month go to the hospital and not be far enough in labor, so they have to go home.
Right.
And that happens often
Yeah.
that you're, going and you're either not in labor yet or labor's not far enough along to be kept. And I understand why the hospital does that because early labor can go on for days.
Right.
But it is a mental shift to like show up and think in triage that you're going to stay. You've packed your bags, you have everything, and then actually you're just going right back home.
Right.
And I think that's tough for people.
It's really tough. And I mean, let's talk about triage, kind of how I mentioned, like all of the things you have to do, like I have to do to get into labor and delivery. It is quite a lot to like get from your home in labor to your hospital realm. You have to like,
Absolutely.
again, like you're walking through security, you're walking down halls while you're in labor.
Mhm.
You go to a triage room. Most places you go to a triage room and they're not terrible, but they're definitely not what I would call like warm and welcoming. They have the lights on, it's bright lights. They immediately want to monitor babies. So immediately they're trying to like get monitors on your belly and they want to monitor baby for like 20-ish minutes at least.
Mhm.
And so that's a long period of time of just kind of being hooked up to these monitors. They want to check your cervix because that's how they determine if they can keep you or you need to go home. And so it's a lot. Like it's a lot of people touching you. It's a lot of people monitoring you. Of course, they're taking your blood pressure, your temperature, all of this stuff is happening. And then they're also asking you a bazillion questions, right? I mean, I don't know how
Right.
many people are like, wait a second, I thought I filled out all of this ahead of time. They still have to ask you all those questions no
Mhm.
matter what you filled out. And so my clients are dealing with a lot of like external stuff happening to them. And then they're also getting asked question after question after question, some of them relevant. And sometimes I'm like, why are we
Why are
asking
we
when you had chicken pox? Like, this is not relevant to what's happening in this moment, right?
right?
So there's a lot. Now, of course,
Mhm.
you show up and you're crowning, they tend to expedite all of this very quickly.
Right, right.
But even
But
then,
you have to be in that, like, massive end stage. Like,
yeah,
I mean, I've had clients where they've said to me, like, "I feel like I'm holding it in until I get to my room."
right.
And that's like, ugh, you don't wanna ever have to, like, make somebody feel that way in those moments, because
Yeah.
that's really stressful. But they will keep, at least here, they will keep you on the monitor for a full 20 before they're putting you in a room for the most part. And I don't know about Denver, but most of the hospitals here do not allow a doula to come in triage. U of M does, the place that we all love does, but everywhere else does not. And I feel like that's kind of a disservice because, as a doula, you're helping a client, you're supporting a client all along the way, and then you can't even be with them in this like time when it's either going to be stay or go. And I mean, I've had clients almost deliver in triage. So to
Totally.
not have support, photos, all of that, just because that's the policy, it's triage, like we just can't. So,
Yeah, triage sucks. I mean, thankfully in Denver, they do allow us back in triage, but it's not a very chill, awesome place. And I think even labor and
gotcha.
delivery nurses would agree with that. It's not like we're saying anything that is news to anybody. And then honestly, I think what I find my clients, many of my clients, to be the one of the most annoying parts of the intake process is getting their blood drawn and their
And
IV
the
put in.
IV.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Like I
Yeah.
can't tell you how many situations where I've had my clients who are having contractions. And again, all the lights are on because the nurses need to be able to see, right, to
Hmm.
adequately put in an IV. And some people are like easy sticks and some people are not easy sticks. And I've watched clients get stuck like 5, 6, 7 times. And I've had people tell me that like the IV process
Was the
was
worst
the worst
part.
part of their whole labor.
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
and I think it's a combination of like you're in pain, you're in an unfamiliar environment, and they're trying to put an IV in. Like, I don't think that the IV itself is like more painful than giving birth. It's the combination of all those factors in this one very specific period of time. So,
Yes.
anyway,
The IV piece, I don't know. The worst part about it for me is I feel like the clients, a lot of clients don't want it, and a lot of clients do come in very far along in labor, and it just feels like this is the right time to just skip this. Like
right.
this client is saying they don't want it. The hospital saying, well, we have to have access, we have to have this. But the client's going to have their baby in a half an hour anyway. And chances are everything's going to be fine. They've labored at home because that
Right.
was their whole point anyway, to have less intervention. So to come in and have to have all of that, I do find that's really a hard process.
It
And
is
I
a hard
think
process.
the doulas here would agree. I mean, like, it's a point of contention at some of the hospitals here, so much so that the doula coalitions and organizations are trying to like speak to hospitals to see if they can make this process more smooth.
Absolutely. And I think you brought up a great point. Like, yes, if you're high risk, if you have a high risk condition and it is obviously you might need to have IV access. If you want an epidural, you need IV access.
Right.
All of these reasons. There's definitely reasons to have it. But
Mhm.
for people that are giving birth unmedicated and labor is progressing easily and well, I'm going to be honest, it's not necessary. Like it really isn't necessary. And I can say that because, again, I spend so much time in community birth and I watch so many women give birth without a HEP lock and there are no issues. Even if we have a hemorrhage, we can generally manage that very quickly and very easily without needing IV access. And guess what? If
Mhm.
we do end up needing IV access, people are often able to get it in. But I've never
Yeah.
actually seen a hemorrhage situation at home or in the community space where not having a HEP lock was a problem, right?
Right.
It wasn't, you know?
No. And even
So
just IV fluids, like the midwives here will absolutely just run a bag of fluids if it's necessary. They will put in an IV if they feel like it's needed. I just don't think it's needed every single time for every single person walking into triage.
absolutely. So I think we should contrast that with what it looks like when you go into labor at home, right?
Yeah. Let's talk about that. Yeah.
It's totally different. You call your
Hmm.
midwife, you say, I think I'm in labor. You usually talk to them on the phone directly. And at that point, they kind of determine, do you want me to come over or do you want me to not and wait a little bit longer?
Hmm.
Usually the call is always in the client's hands. They get to decide if it's time or not. And then if
Hmm.
it is time, the midwife comes over and the door is unlocked. They just come in the door. They find, the woman or the birthing person. They observe them. They just kind of often will sit there and watch them for a little bit. They'll maybe have some
Okay.
casual conversation. It's almost as if like a friend was coming over or someone that you knew and trusted. And wherever you are, be it your bedroom or your bathroom or your living room, nothing changes in your environment. No bright lights go on, no loud noise, no beeping machines. It stays exactly the same. And let me tell you, that is really wonderful for labor hormones because our bodies are designed that if we get put in a situation that's unfamiliar or fearful, that oftentimes it will slow down labor. It's, well known and it happens. When you're
Hmm.
able to stay in your space and stay in your environment, that doesn't happen nearly as often. So the midwife often comes in, they do a lot of assessment, but it looks very different, right? They're checking
Hmm.
baby's heart tones, but they're waiting until the birthing person is ready. And usually it's like with a Doppler and they're listening for a minute or two, sometimes before a contraction and during a contraction and after a contraction. But that's very different than being hooked up to the monitors for 20 minutes, right?
Yes, absolutely. So different.
Very different. And you're able to stand, you're able to squat, you're able to be in
Yeah.
whatever position
If
you
you're
want
in
to
the
be.
tub, you're
Yep.
in the tub,
Yep.
and
Yep.
it's smooth, it's easy.
Yes. Which is,
And what I always love about this, like, and I know you'll appreciate this because we just love birth, is that the midwives always just get down on whatever level the person in labor is at. It doesn't matter if it's like in a tub, in a shower, on the floor, on the toilet. I know that they do this in the hospital too, but it is just nice to have somebody meet you where you are, not
yes,
ask you to move, not ask you to make things easier for them.
right.
And you get to be the person in control the whole time.
Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly what I mean, it's just a different mentality entirely. And the locus of control is really remains always with the person giving birth,
Mhm.
which is how it should be, which is
Yeah.
honestly how it should be. And then, they're still like they check temperature often, they do blood pressure. Like it's not as if they aren't doing all these things. It's just in a very different way. And it's quiet, it's unobtrusive.
Yeah. And I honestly can't remember a lot of these things happening, even though I know that they did. I
Right.
do remember getting my blood pressure because I had to transfer. With my second, I had a home birth. So I labored at home for a bazillion hours. Monet was there. And then we transferred, and I was there for a bazillion hours. And I know that my midwife checked my blood pressure. I know she listened to my daughter. I know she did all of that stuff because I have photos and video of it, but I don't really remember it. It did not affect me. But
Right.
I absolutely remember every time that cuff went off at the
Right.
hospital. I remember the monitor, constantly falling off and somebody always having to come in and then they turn the monitor on really loud so that they could hear the baby. And so it's just this constant like boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
And then anytime you heard it like slow down or speed up, you were worried. And later, I think I finally asked the nurse, like, can we turn this off, please? Like, this is not helping the situation. She's like, oh, yeah. It's just such a different vibe. It just
Yes,
is.
it is. It's very different. I think that I think it's important to realize too that we talked a little bit about like IVs at the hospital. These home birth midwives, they know how to start an IV.
For
They
sure.
know
They sure
how to
do.
do all these extra things if necessary, but it's not a lot of the decisions that are made are not made based on like, this is just hospital policy. This is what we have to do. We're being like extra careful. It's based on what signs are we seeing in the person giving birth that they may or may not benefit from this specific intervention. So if someone's been throwing up for like 5 hours and they're dehydrated and they've got kind of a wonky contraction pattern, sometimes a midwife will say, hey, do you want some IV fluids? I think this might really help. And then they're able to do that. I had a client once who had a really significant hemorrhage and we had done, Pitocin, we had done Cytotec, And I think we eventually started an IV and did TXA, but it was
Mhm.
totally like it was not an emergency. I mean, it was an emergency in the sense that yes, she was having like a hemorrhage, but the midwife was very confidently able to get an IV in and start TXA and manage it all at home. We didn't have to call the ambulance, we didn't have to transfer. And so the sense that like every single person that comes into the hospital absolutely needs a Hep block or an IV when there's so many women that do not want it and they
Mhm.
ask very specifically to not have it. I think it needs to be reconsidered. There's a lot of people, and we hear about this all the time. A lot of people, a lot of labor and delivery nurses and OBs who are like, why would you ever give birth at home? Like, why would you do that? And I think they don't realize that it's because so many of the policies at hospitals are driving people away from making that choice. Something
Mhm.
like a Heplock, if they're low risk and there's informed consent, that should be a no-brainer. That shouldn't be a
Yeah,
big fight, but it is a fight
right.
for a lot of people.
Yep.
And, it's things like that really do drive people to choose a different option. Now, we
Mhm.
didn't want this to be just like negative hospital because
Absolutely
there
not.
are
No.
absolutely reasons to be in the hospital. And one thing that I think, that we have to address is that hospitals do allow for like a fuller spectrum of care, right? Like maybe you're saying, I want an unmedicated birth. And I don't want, any epidural. I don't want any Pitocin. And you go into labor and things get complicated for whatever reason. You can get an epidural very easily. You don't have to change
Mhm.
your birth location. You don't have to change your birth room. There's no disruption. Say things get more complicated and you need a C-section. Well, it's right down the hallway. It might be a little scary, but they can get you back into the OR very quickly and you can have your baby. That is a benefit of the hospital, and we can't deny that. Like having
Absolutely.
that wide spectrum is great.
Mhm.
Transfers can be really hard for home birth families. They can be
They're
hard.
very hard.
They're often harder emotionally than
Mhm.
like most midwives, at least here in Denver, are very good about transferring people before it becomes like a true emergency.
Same
But
here.
it's still really hard when you've been planning a home birth, envisioning a home birth, and then for whatever reason, you have to go to the hospital in the middle of labor. That's
Mhm.
just, I mean, you've
It's
gone through it,
I did it. Yeah,
firsthand
it's
how
hard.
hard it is. It's
Yes.
it's it's really, really challenging. And so I think that we have to create space for that conversation. We have to allow people that had a home birth experience that didn't go as planned. Their feelings are valid, and it's okay if you decide the
Mhm.
next time that you don't want to be at home and maybe the hospital is the best place for you. That's
Yep.
totally valid. I just met with a doula client today who was a birth center client at her last birth and ended up transferring to the hospital. And that was hard. And so this time she's decided, I'm just going to go to the hospital. And she still wants an unmedicated birth, but she doesn't want the stress of thinking about having to transfer again is too much. And so
Mhm.
totally valid to make that call if that's what feels best to you.
Yeah, I have the same situation with this a client right now. She said she had 2 home births and now has had this will be her second hospital birth, and
Right.
she's just more comfortable in the hospital. She feels like her anxiety is a little bit better in the hospital, and it's the right choice for her.
Yeah.
And, like, you and I talk about this a lot, like, when you're working in one place, you only see really what's going on in one place, and you're not seeing the good in both of the places or the bad in
Right.
both of the
Right.
places because there's both. But there does need to be like a consideration of this other perspective that's happening. I
Yes.
mean, home birth midwives need to like understand what hospitals are doing and how they're working in their own community and how
Right.
their hospital providers are working. And the same with the hospital community. They need to meet the home birth midwives. They're going to have to transfer. Like all of this should be cohesive in some way. And I think seeing both sides of it is just really important
It
for
is important.
everyone.
It is.
I mean, we're just like lucky in the sense that we do this job where we get to see both sides of this all the time.
Right.
And it's normal for us, but not everybody has that perspective. And I really, really wish like hospital nurses and midwives and OBs would see some just chill home births because
Yeah, and I know that there are medical programs. I don't know which ones across the country, but there are a few where they actually
Mhm.
will encourage residents to watch a home birth. And I think that is because again, when you talk to people that work in L&D or are upset like obstetricians, and you talk about home birth, their reference to what home birth is like the
It's
very,
every
very
bad
small
outcome.
yeah, it's like the very, very small minority of very bad outcomes. And they're not seeing the hundreds or thousands of completely normal, uncomplicated births.
Mhm.
I To be honest, I've seen some really scary stuff at hospitals. Really scary stuff happen. It happens in both places.
It does.
I had one client lose a baby this year during labor, and that was somebody at a hospital. It was not a home birth, it was a hospital birth. So the notion that only bad outcomes happen at home is not true. I think it's just unfortunately there's a bias when these providers are only seeing the bad outcomes and not seeing the overwhelmingly vast majority of normal, uncomplicated birth.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that sentiment was just echoed. We're both in a Facebook group where that sentiment was just echoed. Like a nurse said, all I see is terrible home birth outcomes. I would never do it. And just kind of went on and on to say, like, why it was just a terrible idea for anybody to ever have a home birth. And that's, she's welcome to that opinion. That is her opinion, but she's only seen all of these bad outcomes. She has not seen any of the good outcomes. And that's where I think this shift in perspective needs to happen. Like, you have to understand that people aren't like choosing to have home births and then all of these bad outcomes are happening. Like, this is a small percentage.
right.
And we see that all the time. We literally see it all the time. I mean, we're at births at homes and birth centers that are great, amazing births that are
Yeah,
happening and they're going beautifully. Like, it doesn't
absolutely.
mean that things don't happen because they do, but people manage them differently.
Right. Absolutely. And, we love hospitals for the amazing work that they do with like our high risk families, right? People that
Yeah,
have high risk
for sure.
conditions, babies that need extra help. There is no
Mhm.
doubt that hospitals serve a very important purpose. And we want to like celebrate them. I mean, I have been at births where we have someone with severe preeclampsia and we're doing magnesium and we're doing Pitocin to try to get that uterus to contract and we're doing all the
Mhm.
things. And it really is taking a full team effort to get that baby out. And so
Yeah.
there is absolutely a space for it. And then there's also people that are like, I just want an epidural. I
Mhm.
just, that, like you
Yep.
said, their client who maybe didn't want an epidural, but just feels less anxious in the hospital space. That is
Mhm.
totally valid. And if you want an epidural, again, like there's not one right way to give birth. Like you really
Mhm.
are not going to be like, you know, there's not one right way to do it. And so if you feel like you need an epidural, then go get an epidural. It's totally okay. It's a valid choice. And I'm really glad that we have hospitals that provide that
Options.
for people
Mhm.
because no one should be forced to give birth in a way that they don't want to give birth. And if you want pain relief, every single person deserves pain relief if they want it. So we want
Mhm.
to just underscore all of this conversation with that like basic
Absolutely. I mean,
value.
my degree is a bachelor's of science degree at the University of Michigan, where now I go into the hospital all the time and work, but I also work in home births in that same community. So, yes, like there's so much balance that can happen on either side if we just can respect both sides of it. And I had a client last year who had like you would never know it to look at her, but she had a multitude of like 3 autoimmune diseases and then something with her hips that did not allow her to, like, walk normally, and you would not know it. Like, you meeting her, you would have no idea, but the hospital was the right place for her to give
Sure,
birth, and she had
sure.
a great birth, she had a great experience, but she couldn't have had a home birth in the sense that it wasn't safe for her, it wasn't safe for her baby,
Right,
and she wasn't comfortable with that.
right,
So people are walking around with more going on in their world than we know and
right,
see. And,
right.
we have to be respectful and kind of all of that.
Absolutely. One other difference that I see between hospital births and home births is cervical checks. At the hospital, it is very rare that you can go into the hospital and be admitted without a cervical check. The exception would be if you are crowning and pushing out a baby. Usually they will let you
They let that slide.
Or if your water has broken and you like have
Mhm.
to stay, but a cervical check is almost always mandatory. And we see it again often when people get to the hospital. We see it during labor, usually every 2 to 4 hours. They want to check progress. And then almost always we see providers wanting to check the cervix before someone starts pushing.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because at home births, many of the births that I attend, I don't see any cervical checks, none.
Mhm.
And we're only checking a cervix if there's some confusion about what's happening, if we're not sure, like, are we, it's been several hours, nothing is really changing. For example, my
Mhm.
own fourth birth, I was about to send everybody home because I thought this isn't going to happen. And so we did a cervical check because I was a multip and I ended up being like 9.5 centimeters dilated. So it was useful information, but that was after
Right.
8 hours of things kind of just staying the same.
Mhm.
At large, like they don't check people. There are other
Yeah.
ways to observe how and where you are in the labor process than a cervical check. And so I think I wish that more hospital providers could watch home birth midwives and see what skills of observation they use to determine where we are in the labor process because you don't need to check a cervix for a baby to be born. You just don't.
Absolutely, you don't. And you don't need to even, I mean, I will hear providers say things, and I didn't hear this as much in Colorado, but like more like, look at her hips or look at how her kind of like her butt almost looks. And when, certain things happen with like hips and movement, the midwives will say like, oh, the baby's definitely lower. And they're right. They're accurate. Or like somebody will be grunty and pushy, and the midwife will be like, I don't think that's quite it yet. And maybe that's when the midwife will check and be like, actually, no, you still have a little bit of cervix left and it's swollen. So I don't know. I do think, like you said, they use those tools when they need them, but not always every step of the way. And in the hospital, I find it the hardest part is when they have to check somebody before pushing. I've seen many times where a client did not want to be checked then. It was very uncomfortable for them. They were pushing, baby was coming down, all the signs were happening. But no, we still had to stick our hands in their vagina to make sure that the baby was going to be born. And I don't see that quite as much at the hospitals that we use regularly, but I do see it in a lot of the Detroit hospitals and the Toledo hospitals. And I'm just like, what are you doing? Like, we do not need this piece of information at all right now. And if you're worried about a swollen cervix, then wait for a few minutes. If pushing does not seem to be doing anything, then check. Like,
Because
it doesn't need to be.
right.
Yeah.
Generally, when you have someone has a strong urge to push and they're
Yes.
bearing down, usually
Yes.
if they're complete, that baby is going to make itself known very quickly. And so again, like you said, give them a couple of contractions. If you're not seeing anything change, then yeah, maybe it makes sense to check and make sure there isn't a lip there. But to not even give people that opportunity, I think
Mhm.
is not it's not what everybody wants. Some people do want to
Yeah.
know, but I think a lot of people would prefer that, hey, if I feel the urge to push and I'm bearing down, let me push out my baby.
Yeah.
I don't need you to tell me, like I know better than anybody else in this room that the baby is about to be here. So I think that's one important difference. I cervical checks, they can serve a purpose, but they are absolutely not necessary. And they do come with risks, the risk of infection, the risk of trauma. It's often can be very traumatic to some people that have a sexual
Yes. It
assault.
absolutely can.
So, if
Absolutely
we
can.
can find ways not to do it, then I think it's worth trying to limit cervical checks as much as possible. And hospitals are getting better about that. They've seen the data, they know, the risks and they've gotten better, but it's still I've never seen anybody at the hospital except, people that are literally pushing out their babies as we're rolling into a room
Yeah.
get through their labor and delivery without at least one cervical check. So,
Yeah, for
uh,
sure.
yeah. So let's talk about what it looks like after the baby is born, because I think that's a pretty drastic difference too.
Yeah.
What I find at home births is that after a baby is born, they are way more relaxed about baby transitioning than the hospital usually is. At the
Yeah.
hospital, and I have like photographic proof of this, as soon as that baby is out, there is one nurse who is vigorously rubbing baby,
Mhm.
rubbing baby, hands on baby. The mom, the birthing person can barely process what is happening because there's somebody that's usually over them, on top
Right over
of them,
them. Yeah.
rubbing the baby.
And that is so important to that person doing that job. Like they're pushing everybody out of the way. I've seen that.
Dad out of the way.
It's not the same nurse. We're not talking
Right.
about one person, but that, baby nurse pushing dad out of the way, pushing me out of the way because this vigorous rubbing has to happen, but it doesn't necessarily need to happen every single time.
No, it doesn't. And we see that at home births. And that's again, like that's the benefit of being in both spaces is that most babies do need a minute or two to transition. Most babies might need a little bit of stimulation, ideally from the parent. But even if
Yeah.
it's the midwife, it does not have to be vigorous or invasive in the
Hmm.
vast majority of situations. Yes, there are times when a baby comes out and is limp and does not look great that we do need to be vigorous, but that is like 2% of the time. It's really not very
Right.
common. And so
Right.
it's hard to be in the hospital when I watch these really vigorous babies come out with great tone.
Hmm.
They're almost already pink, they're crying, and the transition nurses are just completely dominating the space and the time. And it really
Hmm.
is a sacred space. It's a sacred time
Yeah.
for that mom and baby, that birthing person and baby. And to have somebody interject themselves without even analyzing the situation, without really
Right.
looking at the baby and
Looking
saying,
at the
"What is this
baby.
baby doing? Like, does this baby
Yeah.
need me to be super vigorous?" And again, I have seen more and more labor and delivery nurses kind of pause, and that's been wonderful. But
Hmm.
without a doubt, every month I go to a birth where I'm just like,
Yeah.
okay, wow, like this is not
Just step back for a
scary.
minute. Yeah.
And we really see it in the pictures, right, Jen? Because it's like we're
Oh,
editing
for sure.
pictures and it's like every single second of every single first two
Yeah. For the
minutes,
first two
that
minutes.
nurse is
Hmm.
all over that baby. And that really
Yeah.
should, unless there's an emergency, unless the baby is not doing well, that should really be a time for mom and baby to be connecting, to be coming into their bodies again.
Yeah.
Should not
I
be
mean, you have to think about what that baby has just gone through, right?
right.
Like, I mean, the baby has just come out. The cord is most likely still pulsing. So they're still getting oxygen. Like, this whole thing has just happened to this baby, and they just need a minute. And you see that again, like you said, we see it all the time at home births. These babies just need a minute. It's a literal minute. That's
Yeah.
all they need.
Yeah.
And by the end of that 60 seconds, the parent, the mom, or whoever is usually like rubbing the baby's back anyway. They do it naturally.
Right.
And if the midwife needs to do anything, they'll generally just kind of rub and squeeze the baby's back, but then say to the parent, you can do this, or touch the baby's feet, rub the baby's feet. And we just see that gentle, like, transition of care from the midwife catching the baby to allowing the parent to be a
Yes.
parent to the
Yes.
baby.
Exactly. That's so powerful, Jen. And I think that really does kind of illustrate the difference that I think we feel on a cellular level is that at home births, it really
Mhm.
about how can we make this experience such that this mom and these parents feel empowered to
Yes.
take care of this child, not only today,
Yeah.
but for years to come.
Mhm.
It can be really foundational for a lot of people to have that power not taken away from them. And, again, like I said, there are absolutely cases where a baby comes out, maybe, due to medications mom was on during labor, maybe due to baby's, overall well-being, that they do need vigorous stimulation. We're not denying that, but I see it
Mhm.
on babies that are totally fine, that are like 8 or 9 Apgars here in Colorado. That's the best you can get. And there's no discretion. There's no discretion.
There is no
Yeah,
discretion.
yeah,
There's almost no discretion here.
yeah.
U of M is pretty good. The midwives will protect the space. I've seen actual midwives kind of step in and say, let's give them a
Uh-huh.
minute. Let's give them a second, and I really do appreciate that. But anywhere else, there really is no discretion at all.
Right.
And that's really my biggest point of contention, I think, at hospital births. It's just like looking at that baby and looking at the parent and seeing where they are in this process and letting them have a second, because it's generally just a few seconds that's needed. And in a few seconds, nothing's going to change that much that you
Right.
can't help them then.
Right. Right. Because I mean, we're all of everybody's trained, so they all know what to look for. It's very
Right.
evident when a baby comes out, and you can tell like it's limp, colorless. Obviously, there are signs that like this baby needs immediate stimulation. But
Hmm.
we also know what a baby looks like when it comes out and it has great tone, and it's
Yeah.
all of these. So differentiate again. I think that's the hardest part about hospitals is that there's not as much differentiation, and
Hmm.
it's just like this is our policy, and so this is what we do. And
Right.
regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, we're going to do the same policy. So
Hmm.
that's hard. That's
That is
challenging.
hard. That is hard. That is the piece that I'm just like, if I could change anything, it would be that piece. It would
Right.
be delayed cord clamping for everybody. And don't mess with the placenta and don't mess with the baby unless you really, really have to, and give some space to this process because it really is a process that our bodies do a pretty darn good job of doing for us. Science is there to help when needed, but it's not always needed.
Yeah, it's not often needed actually if you're low risk. And then the other thing too is that I often will see like midwives, they step back and give everybody a
The
little bit of,
family.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
and I'm talking about immediately after birth. As long as baby's looking okay, there's kind of this sense of like, okay, let's just give them a second to come back into their bodies. While at hospitals, it's like almost immediately the OB, the provider, they're trying to get the placenta out. They're evaluating for tears. The other nurse is rubbing baby. There's a lot of commotion happening, and there's a lot of things happening to mom and baby. And there's not like a second of like, let's just give them 2 minutes even to just like process what just happened. And so I think
Right.
that's a big difference. And then of
Hmm.
course, like I think people talk about this all the time. Postpartum is very different. That immediate
Oh,
post
yes.
at home,
Hmm.
go into your bed. And it's as simple as that. You're monitored. They check for bleeding. Most home birth midwives stay for like 2 to 4 hours afterwards, make sure that your bleeding is slowing down, that you can go to the bathroom, that you've had food, that baby's latched. At the hospital, it's just different. You're in a hospital,
Hmm.
you're getting checked on often in the middle of the night. There's machines and noise. You're in a hospital bed. All of the things
Hmm.
feel
Yeah.
very different.
It
Not
does feel very different. Yeah. And as somebody who's had that, that was one of the things that I was so looking forward to when I was hoping to have a home birth. And while that's not what happened, that postpartum part is really hard. And the lack of sleep and the constant interruptions, like I can remember so many times where I would finally fall asleep and then somebody would come in. And sleep is so necessary when you have a brand new baby and you've just had a long labor and you've given birth. You need that sleep to be able to continue to do the things that you need to do to, keep your baby alive and safe and feed them and all the things. So, I feel like that piece is really difficult as a patient in the hospital and as somebody who's, seen what it is like at home and hoped that it would be that way for me. Like that part was hard. Rest is so important. Even as a photographer, like I do a lot of newborn photos and photos where I come back into the family's home and everybody asks me like, when should we do this? Should we call you within 7 days? That's what it usually says. I'm like, no, call me when you are comfortable and when you have like gotten a little rest and you feel a little bit better from birth. And that's different for everybody. I mean, for you, Monet, at some of your births, I've seen you just like walking around a couple days later and you're fine. Like you're my friend, you tell me these things and we talk. And I was not walking around, nor was I fine in any couple of days after either one of my births. So I just think that space to like rest and heal and to not have anybody in your space until you need them is really important.
it is. Yeah, it's so important. Well, I feel like we could talk about this for a long
Yes, we
time,
can.
but I think the basic point we want to make is that yes, hospitals do wonderful things and we're grateful that they're here, but there's a lot of beauty to be found in home births. There's a lot of individualization. It's really about the person giving birth, and it's not about like, this is hospital policy, so we need to do X, Y, or Z. And I find that it often is a gentler transition for both mom and baby
Mhm.
because
Absolutely.
they are put at the very center of every part of their story. So we love both, we attend both. Like Jen mentioned earlier, I think we feel really blessed that we have the opportunity to be in both spaces and to see different providers doing their job in different ways. And
Hmm.
I hope that anyone who gives birth feels empowered to choose whatever location most aligns with their values and their beliefs. And the notion that like giving birth at home is so much more risky and unwise thing to do, it's just not true. And I think hospital providers would do, again, if they can kind of help bridge the gap and they can start to see what it looks like and why people are choosing home birth and perhaps
Hmm.
adjust some of their policies. You might not find as many people deciding to give birth at home, but right now the differences can be pretty stark, especially in some
Yeah.
communities. And so
Yeah.
we have to understand and respect people for not wanting to be in an environment where policies and interventions are standard. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, this was a good call.
Yes. Well, should we do a when should I go to this birth?
Yes. Do you have one? Otherwise, we can talk about one of mine. So my client, she is a fourth time. This is her fourth baby, and she's been my client for four times. So I've been with her for all of her other pregnancies. And with this baby, she's having a lot of prodromal labor, which is contractions that hurt, that feel different than Braxton Hicks, but they are not progressing into anything. And this has been going on for weeks. And every year, as a doula, as a photographer, we always have clients that have prodromal labor. Even Monet, you had prodromal labor with your fourth that, caused you to think you were in labor multiple times. And it wasn't. It's hard to judge when you need to go to a birth. So my client actually texted me yesterday and she said, I've been having contractions 1 to 2 minutes apart for 19 hours. So I'm going to go to the hospital just to see what's going on. And she said, I will just let you know what's happening. And she didn't want me to come. She wasn't ready for me to be there. So what do you think happened, even though I'm sure you know the outcome of this?
I mean, the big thing with prodromal labor is that, if it's not changing, especially if it's not changing, then that's probably not labor. If it's staying like 1 to 2, I mean, 1 to 2 minutes sounds kind of intense, but if that's
Right?
going on for 19 hours and her cervix was actually changing as a fourth time mom, you would have had a baby like
10
17 hours
hours ago,
earlier. You know what I
right?
mean? Right. Like,
Yeah.
so I think it's like sometimes, especially if you've had a lot of babies, I do think that the uterus is just more active towards the end. And you just have to pay attention to, is this getting more intense? I think that increasing intensity is like probably the best sign you can look for. And so things are just like happening. Like my client she actually just texted me during this meeting and said, hey, been having contractions for 24 hours, pretty much the same. We're going to go do some induction massage tonight. Okay, that's fine. But again, I would say that that's probably not active labor because if it had been active labor, second baby, we would have had a baby by now, right? If it's not changing, then it's kind of like I tell my clients, okay, like think of this as your new normal. And then you've got to wait for when it changes and it's no longer the same intensity as it is right now. So that's my
Mhm.
guess. My guess is that she's
Yep.
still pregnant and
Yep. She's
be a little
still
bit longer.
pregnant. Yep. And I think she knew, but she was just like, this has just gone on for so long. How do I go to sleep and then maybe have to do this at 2 a.m.?
Totally.
And yeah,
Yeah.
so I mean, I get it. And it's hard. It's a struggle when you have prodromal labor. I've had clients all year who have struggled with it. And as a doula, it's the hardest thing. It's like, I wish I could help you more, but there's not a whole lot you can do.
Yeah, that makes me think about, I think that one of the hardest parts of our job is, again, it's not just being on call and having to get up in the middle of the night. It's helping our clients navigate through the mystery that is birth, right?
Absolutely.
Yes, and it
Yeah.
doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always follow rules. And so that
Yeah.
can be really hard to support. I know you and I both have been kind of on the edge with these clients, and who knows, they
Yeah.
could be tonight or it could be next week. We're still waiting. And that's a hard space to be in mentally. And it's hard for the person giving birth. It's hard for the people that are surrounding them. But
Hmm.
yeah, it is just, it's what makes birth so special is that sometimes it surprises us, even if it's our fourth or fifth baby, we never know what we're going to get. So,
No, it's so true. It's so true. Thanks for tuning in. Find out more about us, our courses, and other tools for birth photography at birthbecomesyou.com. And make sure to follow along on Instagram and Facebook at Birth Becomes You. And if you love listening, make sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever you listen. Thanks. Catch you on the flip side.